so much. I mean, it's really neat to be here. I mean, this presentation is very much focused on national data. I created a couple of slides for what I could find for Illinois, because I think that this can really help shape a way of thinking about things. The Sentencing Project, we are a research and advocacy think tank. So we're a research and advocacy think tank. We advocate for effective and humane responses to crime that minimize imprisonment and criminalization, both of youth and young people, youth and adults, by promoting racial, ethnic, economic, and gender justice. When you do research like this, it's kind of hard not to put it into practice and try to change the world based on what we learn. So we really hope that this is going to be a tool for advocates all over the country. We've had a nice response to the paper, which you can see on screen. I also put the URL to our website there, sentencingproject.org. You just click on youth justice from the top of the page and you'll find some of our other research. This report, I think it's about 9 or 10 pages long. It has 7 charts and some context for it. I'm going to walk through those charts and also provide some extra background to what it is that you're seeing. A couple things to keep in mind through this presentation. Again, I said these are national trends. I certainly looked up some Illinois stuff to make it relevant for you. Many of the numbers that you're going to see are available locally or by state. It differs quite a bit. But I think that it kind of gives an idea of what you may be able to create for Illinois to replicate parts of this or to come up with your own list. Like the 7 graphs that are here are ideas that I came up with and ran past some of my partners, and they're like, yeah, this one, not that one. I don't think there's any sort of reason why these are the most important other than I felt that way. Others may think that there's other relevant stuff. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the numbers that you'll see and you'll hear today are kind of stale by the time that they're released. That's really a frustration of mine, but this is always the most recently available data. I think the goal for this paper is to kind of constantly update it anytime that there's a new set of numbers out there. Lastly, even though we're going to talk a lot about numbers, I hope that people don't lose sight of people behind the numbers. Putting this stuff in context is really about the impact on people's lives, and not only the trends that we see, but how people's lives were changed by the trends that we see. I think that those things need to go together. So I'll start here with the fact that the youth arrest rate has dropped so significantly. You see the numbers dating back to 1980, which is as far back as I have access to the data. And there's an unmistakable trend and pattern here with increases in youth crime reflected in the youth arrest rate through the 1980s and the first half of the 1990s, followed by a pretty steady decline. In 2020, which is the most recent year that we have data, the youth arrest rate fell 80% from its peak year of 1996. That seems to be surprising to a lot of people. The assumption that youth crime is always getting worse or that it's always serious is something that we're up against all the time. This graph, you see it replicated even if you split it out by offenses. The pattern is going to look a little different for different things, depending, but overall, the numbers are in fact moving in the right direction through 2020. And I say that as I shift from facts to opinions. This is a survey question that the Gallup organization asks. Their poll question is there more crime in the US than there was a year ago or less? And this graph shows the percentage of Americans over time, going back 20 years, who said more, who thought there was more crime in the US than a year ago. So from roughly 2002 to 2019, I'd say 2/3 of Americans thought that crime was increasing. And I say that to recognize that this feeling that we're up against of crime being out of control, Americans always believed that crime is worse than it was a year ago. There has been a trend over the last couple of years. The last 3 numbers are 2020, 21, and 22. And that's increased 10 percentage points or so. So we went from like 65% to 75, 80% or so of Americans who thought crime was increasing. That increase is entirely localized among Republicans. And you see similar patterns when you ask people like, is the economy better or worse? Like when there's a Republican in office, Republicans say the economy's getting better, and a Democrat becomes president and Republicans say it's getting worse. So I take that increase with a grain of salt. I think it reflects partisanship, but I think that baseline of 2/3 of Americans sort of always think crime is going up, regardless of the fact that it's generally been decreasing, is really worth keeping in mind. And I think it's also worth keeping in mind that we've had amazing wins in these years, despite the fact that people have thought crime was going up. This is not an insurmountable barrier. We can still get stuff done, even if people think crime is getting worse. So I have a couple of more graphs to share about what happens when fewer kids are being arrested. Shown here is the one-day count of kids in juvenile facilities. Youth arrests, as you may recall, peaked in 1996. Youth incarceration peaked in 2000 and has fallen 77% since. If you look at the graph, the drop from 2019 to 2020, that's a pretty steep little drop that happened there. And I imagine that once the 2021 numbers come out, we'll see a little rebound. 2020 was such a weird year. But you can see for yourself the pattern, again, an increase through the year 2000 and then a steady decline ever since. Important to realize these are one-day counts. They're generally taken in late October. The total number of kids who are detained and committed is much higher than the number who show up on a single day, especially on the detention side, because we churn through so many kids in detention. And I wrote a paper a year ago titled "Too Many Locked Doors" that gets into the limitations of the one-day count. For all of us who are seeking funding on this issue, I'm trying to convince people to get away from the one-day count, because to hear 25,000 kids are locked up, that sounds like a manageable problem. But when you hear 200,000 kids admitted to detention or commitment over the course of a year, that really gives you a sense of the real footprint of the problem. So we can also divide this out by rates for state. The report itself has all 50 states. That was an impossible slide to read in presenting, so I did not do every state. The US average is in red in the middle, 114 per 100,000 kids. And Illinois is in fact much lower than most of its neighbors. All the neighbors that you see there, Illinois is at 64 per 100,000. And other places in your neighborhood are doing much worse locking up kids. I highlight Wisconsin because Wisconsin's rate is comprised of 10 to 16-year-olds, not 10 to 17-year-olds. They, unlike Illinois, have yet to raise the age, so that's sort of an artificially low number. But this is something probably worth celebrating to an extent. I also want to take a look at the number of youth in adults, prisons, and jails. Again, this is a one-day count. That number peaked in 1997 and it's dropped by 84% since then. This change reflects both the drops in youth arrests, but also changes in laws that disallowed holding youth in adult facilities. We're seeing far fewer kids in adult prisons. I think that number is like 200 in the 2021 count, whereas the number in jails is much higher. Again, because it's a one-day count, the real footprint of this is going to be much larger, but I don't have admissions to jails and prisons over the course of a year. The trend, though, is terrific. I mean, we were at like 14,000 in 1997 and dropping down to, 2,000 or so, something like that in the most recent count. These numbers, by the details are all in the report itself. I took a look at the youth in Illinois' adult prisons where available, and that success story is really something. I could go back to 1998. This is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics reports. 162 on a single day in 1998, steady decline, plummeting in 2014 and 2015 to a point that for now the last 5 years that there's been one-day counts, there's been no people under 18 in your adult prisons. That's fantastic. What's not fantastic, both for Illinois and the whole country, is the racial and ethnic disparities that we see in youth incarceration. So the top bar on this screen is the incarceration rate for Black youth, 315 per 100,000 Black kids in this country. And you can compare that to like the white rate, second from the bottom, 72 per 100,000. What that means is that Black youth are about 4.5 times as likely to be incarcerated in the juvenile system as their white peers are. I also took a look at the Illinois disparities. The Black rate of 218 compares to a white rate of 32. There's a really high tribal incarceration rate, but that's a little deceptive because there's not that many tribal youth in Illinois. So that rate is based on the incarceration of 6 kids on the one-day count. When we do our fact sheets on this, I sort of limit the comparisons to states that have significant numbers of youth of that background. So like, you know, the one-day count will show that there's 0 Latino kids in Vermont who are locked up on a one day. But what does that really tell you when there really aren't that many Latino kids in Vermont? So I think the relevant comparisons are when there's a significant population of the youth of that background. So I did the US on the last slide. This is Illinois. And now I'm going to make one that's really hard for you to read. And I hope you'll follow along with it because I'm going to walk you through the US and Illinois racial and ethnic disparities. On the left side is the US numbers that I showed, and the right side is the Illinois numbers. These are rates depending on youth of different backgrounds. And it's also worth noting that you can compare, you know, Black to Black, white to white for Illinois and the United States. And, you know, as shown on that slide that listed a bunch of states, that Illinois is in fact lower than the national average, both comparing Black youth to Black youth elsewhere and Latino youth in Illinois to elsewhere, et cetera. But when we talk about disparities, it's really about the likelihood of incarceration among youth of that background. So let's look at the US side on the left first, the Black rate of 315, the white rate of 72. When you divide 315 by 72, that's when you get 4.5 times as likely. The Black youth in the US are 4.5 times as likely to be incarcerated as their white peers. You do that same math in Illinois, and the disparity is much worse. You know, with Black youth being 218 out of every 100,000 to be incarcerated versus 32 for white youth. You know, 218 divided by 32, that's 6.8. I mean, call it 50% worse than the national average. That is a huge problem to be addressed. You know, we just see such low rates of white youth being locked up, and I think it just reflects white youth getting second chances and more leniency that other youth don't. The report goes into the sources of the racial and ethnic disparities that end with incarceration rates. You know, one thing that's very interesting to see is that offending rates, this is self-reported offending rates of different backgrounds, youth of different backgrounds, are pretty close to each other. The Centers for Disease Control run something called a Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and it, you know, questions risky behavior. So, you know, did you use a seatbelt the last time you got in a car? Did you use a bike helmet? Do you smoke cigarettes? Have you smoked marijuana in the last 30 days? Questions like this. And while youth of all backgrounds are not identical to each other, they aren't particularly different from each other. And the differences that you see don't explain the differences in arrest rates. In fact, white youth are more likely to report carrying weapons. Black youth are more likely to report getting into fights. Black youth are more likely to report using marijuana. White youth are more likely to report using cocaine and opioids. Like, it just, there's no obvious patterns here. It won't surprise any of us that kids are kids, right? Like, they do things that we wish that they wouldn't, and it doesn't explain the differences in arrest rates. Youth of color are much more likely to be arrested than white youth are, probably due to the enhanced police presence in their neighborhood. We have remarkable residential segregation in this country, schools that are segregated as well, and the presence of school resource officers drive kids from some schools into the courts, where kids who look like mine probably get detention for the same behaviors. Now, even after arrest, youth of color are then treated much more harshly. That white youth are much more likely to get probation, and Black youth are more likely to be committed. White kids are more likely to be diverted out of the system. Black kids are more likely to have formal processing. You know, it's really, when you do apples to apples comparisons, you know, this isn't comparing shoplifters to Tony Soprano. This is really kids with similar offending histories are treated much more harshly when they are youth of color, especially Black youth, and in communities with high tribal populations as well. The disparities for Latino youth are not quite as sharp, which is some good news to share. So the conclusion of this is so that while Black youth are about 2.5 times as likely to be arrested compared to their white peers, they're 4.5 times more likely to be incarcerated. So it's not just about differences in behavior, which are not significant, or differences in arrest, which are different, but that kids get treated more harshly throughout the system. So that